We're restarting from here. I have Ariel on here, and we are doing Symposium night. He's been the top contributor on the school membership community, which is free for everyone to join. Link in the description below. We're doing awesome things over there. Ariel and I were just talking briefly about building community
Yeah.
and leadership. And there's this really interesting thing that happens. A lot of people here, let me just recap 5 minutes real quick.
Get it.
A couple things. One of the things that we all need right now is a sense of comrades in life, is building a community, a tribe. It's one of the most essential things that we all need to do in our lives is build this tribe. And I think that's going to be the massive change in our generation. Housing prices are ridiculous. People are more isolated than ever. Depression, singleness, it's all just rising through the roof. And there's going to be this point of transformation where people need to find kindred spirits and actually build towards something new with a chosen family, I think. And that can start by building a brotherhood group. This is a really deep idea. I could go off on this forever, in the sense of how do we create a new us versus them? Because camaraderie and cooperation reaches its highest point when there's an external adversary. How do we identify an adversary in the world that we're actually building defense against, in a sense? But also just in the basic understanding of how do you find the right people in your community that are, maybe on the same wavelength of you as you, and start building a network, a circle with them. And Ariel was just talking about how do we create citizens? Because when you lead something, when you start something, I know for me, starting a brotherhood group, I found all these men, I connected all these men, I set up the container, we started doing awesome stuff, but slowly everyone just became homies, like really close connected homies. It's exactly what I wanted to build. And as you build that, you also need to let go of it, because in small groups of equals, it's egalitarian in general. And the whole goal of a leader should be to provide the space, in a sense, to create citizens. And this is what I want to do on school, is like I want to host these spaces, have people on to have discussions, and create the space where people can become citizens, where they can rise up as their own leader and their own voice inside of that. So could you tell me a little bit more about your process of citizenship versus consumer? Because I really like this idea from Audi over here.
Yeah, for sure. So what I was getting into is that oftentimes in the political sense, our political leaders are vying for our vote. And the way that they do that is they try to cater to us by giving us what they think that we want. And sometimes it is what we want. But what happens that you start to create a cycle of like, oh, he will give me what I want. Let me demand more. Let me tell him what I want. I want this and that. And so what happens is that in that process, you start creating consumers who then have expectations of what they expect you to do for them as their leader. And so then you put yourself in this position where you're constantly having to serve in that way. Whereas the process of creating citizens is to bring people together and present the problem and then open up the floor and be like, how do we want to approach this? How do we want to handle this? And what that does is that empowers everyone to take responsibility of how we're going to take on this challenge that is coming into our community, that is impacting the way that we gather or whatever it might be, however it's influencing us in whatever way. So it's that simple shift of, as a true leader, it's not about serving, it's about framing. It's about bringing people together, asking the right questions, and allowing the people in the room to have conversations among themselves, not one-on-one with you as the leader, but with the other citizens in the room, and be like, how do you think we should handle this problem? What do you think is the major talking point that we need to handle in this 1 hour that we're together? And it's through that you create that camaraderie, because people are then, instead of it being a one-to-one relationship with the person on stage, it becomes a multi-web of interconnectedness between everyone there that continues to exist once we leave that space. Once that problem is solved, or that meeting is done for that day, we all leave with something to chew on, in the sense that we've contributed and we've received. and we continue that cyclical process of building citizens that way.
I really like I really like that whole concept. And I like the concept of the leader frames.
Yeah.
I think this is revolutionary for everyone listening to this is to be a better leader is to hold a better frame personally and set a better frame for the collective, for the group. I think about this when I host circles for men, right? And one of the most important jobs in hosting the circles is not really what you say, it's about how you start the frame in the sense of, hey guys, we're here not to like regurgitate something or be in our heads. We're here to spit raw from the heart and try to keep it to a paragraph. And like, I want your honest full self. Can we make that agreement here that we're going to bring our honest, rawest self to this container? Say I, sweet. And we set that frame. And then something beautiful happens is everyone is coming. And if you don't set that frame, like even on a coaching call with someone new for me, if I don't set the frame like, hey Ari, I have, 15 minutes and like I want to have like a raw discussion with you. Like, are you open to being vulnerable with me? If I can set that frame, the time frame, like people know and can actually like can rise into a citizen in that sense. Yeah. This talk of citizenship brings me to a really interesting cultural philosophical perspective too. And that is of our founding fathers. And they thought to have great citizens, you need three things. This is Thomas Jefferson. Mm-hmm. And it's very different from the political leaders you're talking about now. And there's three things that citizens need. It's private land ownership, influence in self-governance, and virtue. And virtue comes from God. So I've been thinking a lot about these three things. And what they all do is they create a sense of having a stake in the community, right? So if you own land that your kids are going to inherit from you, you want to take care of that land and you want to take care of the community around you so that there's a flourishing space. If you have influence in small self-governance instead of like huge executive power, there's a lot of local power.
Yeah.
You actually care about the politics and things happening in your community. So you want to participate. You have meaning. You have stake, right? And then virtue is the other thing is if you feel like everyone is rising towards virtue with you, that's gonna just create meaning and like you have good people around you, I think. Yeah. But this idea of having a stake, do you have any thoughts around how do we create this feeling of like I have a stake in this community?
Oh, that's such a good question. I don't know.
Yeah.
With you, I don't know. I was actually thinking of asking you, like, of those three, like, what do you feel is lacking the most? But I love that question. I would love for you to speak into that a bit if you can.
Yeah, I think that was a question for the whole audience that's watching is how do we create the sense of having a stake in a community? I would say number one is people are bought into the vision and the vision impacts them in the sense of like, let's say I lived on a community piece of land, right? No one had a stake there. I knew I was going to be gone in a few months. Everyone knew they weren't going to inherit any piece of the land, right? So like there was never really a sense of camaraderie or community because we weren't united in a vision that's going to impact us all. Mm. And I think that's what like self-governance comes from is like if you don't think you're going to be in a place very long, I really do think like having a stake in the future and having a vision of the future is really important. And what's happening right now in the world? Why do we have no more citizens? Is literally because if you go down the street and ask everyone, almost everyone thinks like the economy's gonna fall, the world's gonna collapse, World War III is coming. Like we are literally everyone is prophesizing the end right now. And that creates no meaning or stake in your personal action or your action into your community. Like no one gives a shit. I think that's like so maybe a hope in a vision would be the thing that actually creates a stake.
Yeah. Oh man. Okay. Now that you say that, you just reminded me, like it connected with me that I'm also part of a festival that takes place here. And I think I shared a little bit with this with you before.
Yeah.
But the festival is a way of raising funds and finding the right people to actually move into an intentional community. And we actually just
Ooh.
had our meeting last week, and everyone who's there in that meeting, there's about like 20 of us,
Yeah.
everyone's invested. Everyone's invested. And it's because the founder of this festival is so grounded in his purpose of creating this that
Yeah.
I feel it's inspiring to everyone. They can see how passionate he is about it. And the values that he speaks of are like these universal values. I feel like those three
Mm.
that you mentioned as well is
Yeah.
about ownership of the land that we move on to and the influence that they will have. And what we're navigating now is that virtue. It's like, how do we create that virtue for
Mm.
everyone to connect with in a
Yeah.
way that that resonates? And it's just been
Yeah.
so beautiful to see that. So yeah, I think that's huge, man. I think that bigger vision and
Yeah.
making people feel valued in that vision, that you have a role, that you're not insignificant, that you
Totally.
need to be here. We need you.
Yeah. Absolutely. That's a great example of two things stood out to me there. It feels like you have a stake in its creation because it's going to impact your future, and also you believe in the leader.
Yeah.
I think that's so key. And we were talking about how in small groups earlier, like small groups tend to be very egalitarian. But the moment that you need to move towards something, like someone has to be like framing it correctly
Yeah.
and framing the future correctly. Um, and I think that's that's what leadership is how convicted are you of that why. I have a this is a good segue actually. I'm gonna share my screen and share a post from the school community here.
Nice.
Can you see my screen?
I cannot know, but maybe the guest can.
Yeah, I think they can. Let me just make sure we're all. All right, I think we're rolling here. I had this post about rallying the Tigers. What would you die for? Um, and it was kind of like this raw post about my experience of trying to find purpose, trying to find something to die for. And it's a very like melodramatic way of talking about it, but it's kind of true in a sense. Is like we are all looking for something that we can totally live and die for. Whether we find that in family, whether we find that in a project we really believe in, whether we find that in the culture we want to build. And I think right now, at this critical time in history, is there's this massive darkness in the world and this massive opportunity to create something new. And something new is only ever created once the problem gets bad enough. Heraclitus has this quote that says, change is the result of strife and necessity. If the grocery store shut down, everyone who really wants self-sovereignty with food would finally have it because they have to do it now. So it's like once something gets bad enough, change happens. And I think things are getting to that boiling point where there's some kind of revolution coming. And so there's this awesome opportunity for leaders who are visionaries in a sense right now, who want to look into the future and look deep into the past of where we've been and what has worked in the past and what can we learn from our experience to actually create a future with. And I wrote that the goal is still distant and murky, but it becomes clear with every step of growth. That's why the revolution is led by wisdom warriors, men of lofty ideals and action. And this is critical. There's one of my favorite quotes from the Colburn Bible is right now we need men who are good and great. And that's a really rare combination. Is usually we have great men who are not good or good men who are not great. And it's like you need good and great men right now, and that's what a wisdom warrior is striving to become, is a man of lofty ideals and actions. And Ariel commented on that post something I really liked, and he said, quote, the society that separates its scholars from its warriors will have its thinking done by cowards and its fighting done by fools. That's a Thucydides quote, one of the greatest historians of all time in ancient Greece. And he says, I've definitely been a weak scholar, hyper fixated, hyper fixated on gathering knowledge, yet never taking action. A change is brewing. And I think that is maybe a story most people can relate to here. Is like we're maybe called into a position of leadership. We're called to create community. We're called to create something, to be an entrepreneur in some way. And we have lofty ideals. Maybe we've had like spiritual or philosophical awakenings. And I think this time it's really important to come into life as a warrior again. Um, yeah. When you commented on that post, what were you kind of thinking as in terms of becoming a warrior?
Oh man, it was a deep reflection for me on my behavior of the past and all the opportunities that I've missed because I wasn't tapping into that warrior energy. And
Mm,
so my one of my guiding principles now is function over systems, and it can also be seen as function over knowledge, to be taking action over the gathering of knowledge that may help me take better action, because any action is better than no action. And so the visual
mm.
that I have in mind is I was obsessively making sure that the wheels on my cart were perfectly round and symmetrical.
Yeah,
And now I've been recognizing that's great and all, but I'm not taking this cart anywhere. I'm not pulling it. I'm just
totally.
fixated on the roundness of the wheels. So now the mentality is like, I would rather pull a cart with square wheels and allow the process of dragging it
Yeah.
along the trail round out the wheels in that process, rather than having that heavy effort into just
Yeah.
rounding the wheels.
That is one of the best metaphors I've ever heard for that process of to start pulling your damn cart and the wheels will fall into shape. Really interesting because I posted a video. It's my most popular video, and it's called Nietzsche on why suffering makes you beautiful. And I literally get about 20 hateful comments every single day, like, "Hey brother, like you're not in the Ukraine war," or "Hey dude, like you obviously haven't suffered much in your life. Go visit a third world country." Blah blah blah. And it's so interesting to me is I'll make a video about a universal experience of the human condition and people instantly want to point out how their suffering or someone else's suffering is worse than yours. And it's so interesting to me is like how we want a war story. Like I think of it as like, what's your war story and how is that group's war story worse than yours? And I'm like, hey, we all lose people we love. Our parents are gonna die. We can break our necks in a car accident. I went through the most acute, addiction, self abuse, insomnia, crazy heartbreaks. Most people here have had extreme suffering to some degree. And if you haven't, well, you have great karma in this life and your time's going to come. Like suffering is inevitable in this life. And the most acute form of suffering that we all face is in the heart, always in the heart. I mean, yes, unless you're getting tortured, I think that's a different thing of acute suffering. And also, starving is an acute form of suffering. But, like, you know, the for instance, the white men at the top of the social ladder kill themselves more than anyone else. You know, suffering is this very relative thing that, and we're all humans. We all have this heart, and I think so much of philosophy and spirituality come because of our suffering in some way and how we make sense of that suffering. And that's why I was curious uh, about the warrior philosopher here on making sense of suffering and also using suffering to your advantage. And I think that's what separates different types of people is how do you face the suffering of life? Are we creating more comfort and ease and trying to escape it? Or are we learning from it? Are we growing stronger through it? So I think this is a really huge concept. But yeah, if you guys have anything to say about that.
Well, it's kind of like I know you also enjoy bringing up Fight Club as do I, right? And there's that scene. I forget if it's in the book as well, but it's when Tyler Durden's sort of addressing all the members of Fight Club, and
Mm,
he basically says, we have no great war, no great depression. Our great
mm,
war is a spiritual war. Our great depression is our lives. And it's interesting, right? Because you said like everyone wants a war story, and you were talking about camaraderie earlier, and you're talking about like what motivates a people to be bought into a greater goal. And for
mm,
most of human history, war was that unifying thing. It forced people. And again, you said like if regular the regular production of food was disrupted, people would be forced to make their own food. They'd be forced to do that. And I think a lot of the savage excellence we see in nature comes from conflict. It comes from the antelope must be fast enough to outrun the lion. It comes from the lion being fast enough to catch the antelope, from the lion being strong enough to fight off 20 hyenas or to claim his own pride once he's of age. And that's essentially war in the state of nature. And then for mankind, when we think of nature as sort of demanding excellence out of us, we often do think of war. And, of course, war is terrible. War has immense suffering, immense brutality. But we can't deny that there is this element of warfare which forces us to be virile, to be strong. And today, we don't have the same amounts of suffering, the same issues that our ancestors did. And, part of that's good because to a certain extent, to pursue things like philosophy or knowledge, you need the free time away from warfare, away from famine, away from these sort of backbreaking things to be able to pursue greater knowledge, right? That's why the Greeks were so great. Well, one of the unfortunate reasons they were great is because, they did depend upon a huge labor class and a slave class.
Yeah.
But what this did is it allowed them to pursue warfare, allowed them to pursue the arts, to pursue the sciences.
Yep.
So, we're gifted today in the sense that we don't need a huge labor class to have that same benefit. So we have this immense opportunity. Like I was thinking, like we have these little iPhones which have more knowledge in them than 300,000 years of human history. And what do we do with them, right? We waste it. It's like we have all this potential. Yeah, exactly, right? Or
fucking cat videos.
Yeah. Well, cat videos is probably one of the better things people are like looking at on
True
TikTok
that.
these days, right? Like that's at least a little wholesome, but like we have so much potential that we're not using and that we're not maximizing. And I think it's because for all of our history, nature has dictated how we develop, right? Nature has forced us to be strong. So when nature doesn't force us to be strong, we have to simulate the conditions of nature to create the most capable and the strongest and smartest and most beautiful people. Because beauty is health, essentially. This is a very Nietzschean concept. Twilight of the Idols beautifully illustrates this. He talks about a philosophy of the body. Like beauty is health, and health is being able to survive, being able to thrive, right? And we don't have a reason to be beautiful like we did before. Everything is tied to consumerism today. It's tied to very materialistic things where in the past, the material transcended to an element of spirituality because, we had these great religious doctrines of warriors, these spiritual movements which tied our material actions to something more. And we're so lacking in that today because our Great Depression is our lives and our Great War is a spiritual war. It's this nihilistic age, we're surfing the Kali Yuga, whatever. Yeah. And Nietzsche talks about it, obviously. And this is exactly what he talks about. We're in this nihilistic age, and how do we answer this issue of nihilism, right?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. You unpack something there that me and Ari opened up briefly. And it's an idea that I would love to have a symposium around. And it's about how war and conflict create virtue. And how we need conflict. We need an us versus them in order to actually have a group of comrades, in order to have a group, to have group synergy. And this is one of the really unfortunate aspects of human life that I'm like learning as I get older is we when you don't have a unified cause against something else, there is no flourishing culture and vertical growth. And there's a couple evidences I can cite, and then we'll just kind of have a discussion around this. But human life grows most rapidly on a frontier. And a frontier is where you're at the edge of the known world and you're in between and against opposing tribes usually. So you have great danger, you have great threat, and that great threat and danger creates the highest level of personal responsibility and group responsibility in a tribe because you have a great threat and danger. And this demands virtue of people. And this is why the idea that war is the father of all things and war creates virtue is so true. And these are both ancient Greek ideas. Is in peacetime, there's debauchery because there's no, like, you and your brothers aren't going to die tomorrow. You're not going to battle the next day. You may never go to battle again. So what do? Like you have a good time. You get drunk, you hang out, you drink wine, you enjoy peacetime, debauchery ensues, and the breakdown of values because there's no great hardship. Um, and then when war comes around, everyone's like, yo, I need you to be your best so you got my back and you got my family's back. Like, how are you hunting? How are you living? How are you training? All of a sudden virtue is demanded of a populace because there's great external threat. And this is the idea of wasabia. There's this idea, it's from Ibn Khaldun. It's an idea, he's a philosopher, a Muslim philosopher from a while back. And he had this idea of wasabia. And wasabia is shared group feeling. And it's actually what we all crave is we're having a conversation, but really what I want at the highest level is to be united towards a vision with shared group feeling with you guys. That would be amazing. And that's how we create citizens. And to have wasabia, you need a frontier. You need open space to conquer and an enemy against you. So it's like, that's so rooted into human nature, but we don't want it to be. And what can we do about it? So yeah, that was kind of my little spiel, just to open the floor here a little bit. And if we can stay focused on this subject for the rest of the call, that would be fabulous. I would rather dive deep than go broad. Yeah. So Ari, I know you've been listening. You've been smiling here. What's something that was coming up for you when I was talking about that?
Yeah, I want to get a deeper understanding of how, okay, so what was coming up for me, and I think the shift that we're in now is that in the past, in our history, in our evolution, from what you guys were sharing, these things were demanded from us. The situations would arise and we would rise to meet the situation and the demands that it would put upon us. Yeah. What I feel the opportunity is now, with our ability of conscious choice, is what is the frontier that we can voluntarily approach and explore that isn't being demanded of us. I feel like that's where the next wave of our evolution is not constantly waiting for the demands of the world to create this from us, but rather from this state of peace, looking out and being like, where do I want to challenge myself? And in what ways can I approach that challenge? And so the question that was coming up for me is there a way of doing that outside of warfare? And if so, what does that look like?
I am so happy you asked that question. That's my question too. Is where's our frontier, especially as men? Where's our frontier? Where's our open space? Where's our battle that we can go conquer together? Mm-hmm. And how do we do that outside of warfare with each other? Yeah. To summarize. Yeah.
Who knows? Like, if you look at how the world's boiling up today, warfare could be a constant for the next, decade if things go wrong, right? So I think there's certainly, how do we simulate it outside of war? How do we simulate suffering outside of war? That's an important question. But it's also important to recognize war is still a reality for most people in the world, and it may be a reality for us very soon as well, right? They used to say that the Spartans lusted for battle because it was like a lull between the chaos, because their training was so hard that war was almost like a vacation, right? Right? So it's like,
that's wild.
So, I mean, as someone in the military, I'll tell you, training is not that hard these days. To a certain extent, we've gotten a little bit complacent, I think, in terms of realizing how close we are to war. Because, I just got back from a deployment back in October, and we were basically patrolling the Western Pacific. So that's all the areas where China is big, and you realize China's a lot of freaking people out there. They not only have a lot of businesses that are subsidized by the state that they're building up in certain countries. Not only do they have a lot of actual, military units that are patrolling around there too, but they're gearing up. They're in a very good position, especially because of how bad their economy is right now. They almost need a war to unify their country. That makes them more dangerous, right? Like the tiger, or like the cornered tiger, is most dangerous. So I think it's important to recognize that war itself is not something we should ignore either. Not just warrior in spirit, but warrior in a physical sense. Like we we need to know or be prepared mentally or physically that war could still be a reality for us today, even if it is far removed compared to the past. So that's one thing I'll say. But
Mm.
going back what you
Oh,
said about
hold on.
yeah,
One recap there. The that war and
mm,
specifically the preparation for war is what creates virtue. So there has to be some event that is, I guess, creating camaraderie and creating virtue. But keep going on.
yeah. So just what you were saying about like the frontier, right? Which I found interesting because there's two things that come to mind. I think of the sort of Faustian spirit of man. Like when you look
Mm.
at an open ocean or an open field or even the stars, you get this idea of going to the unknown, right? And it brings me back, um, I saw your video on like Bronze Age mindset, right? And this idea of
Mm-hmm.
mastering space. And he talks about the nomadic versus the sedentary peoples. Um, and the nomadic peoples who don't who don't live off the land in the same way. The shepherd at night, all he has is the stars to keep him company. So he's looking
Mm.
outward. He's looking across the plains, whereas the sedentary agricultural society is looking only in the earth. They're looking down. They're not looking beyond.
Mm.
Like, what are we going to conquer next? And we could have a whole discussion just on the whole process of the nomadic peoples eventually conquering the sedentary peoples, which is a very interesting thing to unpack historically and philosophically. So I don't want to go too deep into that. But just this idea of mastering space, of mastering the unknown, because when everything has been discovered land-wise, when you see a city, for example, you don't get the same Faustian spirit of mastering space. And my solution personally, like once I have enough money, I'm gonna go live in Montana or Wyoming
Yeah.
and like start a goat farm. I'm gonna buy 100 acres of land so that me and my children can grow up,
Totally.
surrounded by open space. Have plenty of room to like just
Yeah.
be like human beings should live in more of those
Totally.
sort of open spaces, right? So yeah, return
Yeah.
to nature, get back into that
Yeah.
sort of primal and virile
Totally.
mindset.
I think you, in a way, you answered the question in the sense of perhaps we don't need war to create camaraderie. What we need is open space and danger. And that can come from outside of direct conflict with other humans. It can come from conflict with nature. And I think of even business. Like business is basically the frontier today. It's where warfare happens. It's where like highly inspired and motivated people get together on a team to go compete with others and create a vision. And I don't quite have this idea fully flushed out yet, but I mean, my ideal is how do we create a band of comrades and brothers that have families, so we're building a community, and we go out and hunt for resources and bring them back to like the tribe. And inside of this, we're creating a culture that is basically a new renaissance. That would be amazing. How do we do that?
We all got to move to Montana.
Well, exactly. It's
Yeah.
interesting. Is I think we need to build our resources and ourselves and our networks in cities first, because if we just move to Montana, you're going to be filling one aspect of that dream, and that's going to be having
Mhm.
open space that actually leads to a flourishing human experience, right? But you're missing the aspect of how do you do it with comrades
Mhm.
and and also there's a sense of right now a lot of people want to go back to homesteading, want to go back to hunter gatherer, or want to like revert back to a more indigenous way of life, which is beautiful in a sense. But also it's a reversion. We came to this pinnacle of society and technology and where we're at in order to transcend and bring back something from the past, but not return to the past in a sense. And so the question is how can we go backwards to having a more natural open space to conquer with a community, right? But also have a vision that we're building towards. And that vision can't just be I'm trying to become a hunter gatherer again. You know? That's an interesting thought.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah. And I feel like a lot of this stuff happens in conversation and in community. It's the ability to be able to get together to share these ideas and finding the connections within each other that like, yeah, that resonates with me, or no, that sounds totally stupid. And then it's just like those conversations of navigating the difficulties and the recognition that everything that we may believe that is the ideal may be
Mm.
wrong parts of it
Mm.
may be wrong. And so
Yeah.
it's that ability to dive into those conversations with each other and be like, hey, this is what I'm thinking about. What do you guys think? And then see where other people land, and then navigating that space together. Like what I feel like what you were hinting at with the buying the land of in Montana, so you can't do it alone. And the
Yeah.
process of not being able to do it alone involves these conversations of just diving into it and being able to call each other out and have that discourse in it. And so
Mm.
I feel like there's still like that missing element of like, what is the essence of war that drives that growth? And I feel like if we could kind of like learn a little bit more about that, like, is it the suffering? Is it the challenge? Is it the demand? And how can we recreate that for ourselves in a way that allows us to take everything we've learned from our past, combine it with the technology and the resources that we have today to move towards that future that is idyllic in a lot of ways, but
Totally.
it's still something that's constantly being discussed. It's not that that one vision is the right vision. It's the context is always the lever that decides where the community should go. It determines what is
Mm.
most important at this time. And
Yeah.
so I feel like it's a constant conversation, not something that we pinpoint and then move towards. It's we got to be constantly navigating it as we move towards it. It's a moving target in a lot
Yeah.
of ways.
I really appreciate your grounded voice in this circle. So thank you for that. And
Of course.
it's funny what you speak, you do. You're like, we need to have conversations around this. We need to have community, and you're doing it. So thank you.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I guess
Yeah, you got something?
I was gonna say my question is, is it necessary to have the sort of city or urban lifestyle in order to progress technologically? Because I would argue that in terms of like urban centers throughout the world, they fulfill the function of producing goods. They fulfill the function of contributing to the overall like gross domestic product of a a country or whatever. But do labs need to be in the city? Do do colleges need to be in the city? Do these areas where actual innovation takes place? Like the way I see it, right? You look at countries like
Could you speak up a little bit? And your
yeah.
camera froze.
Oh
Oh,
shit.
actually,
Can you hear me now?
I think my camera froze. My whole laptop froze.
Yeah, I could still see him. He's good for me.
Oh shit, my laptop froze, guys.
Can we just pause for a sec?
Yeah. Hold on.
Can you hear me now?
I think my camera froze. Well, my screen's frozen, but everything else is working, so we're just gonna keep going.
You can hear us?
So
Okay. As long as
I can
you-
hear you, and the live stream's still working. I just can't see you guys anymore, so I'm just gonna have a conversation without looking at my computer now.
There you go.
Hell yeah.
All right.
Improvise,
Uh,
adapt.
Yeah, let's okay, keep going with the urban center thought and moving outside of the urban center.
So I was just saying, I don't think it's a necessary condition of innovation to be a part of the city lifestyle. I think you could have labs, like separate from major urban centers. You can have academic centers away from that. Like you don't have to adhere to the city life to have human innovation, right? You need that to produce goods. You need that
Yeah.
to industrialize, but you don't need that for the actual human innovation side of it. You can still be some guy, I think,
Totally.
right, who lives in this community, but then you can still, like think the internet, right? We have all this access to information, we continue learning without necessarily needing to be in big groups, at least. Like we need community, but we don't need to be in that super condensed city environment, I think.
I appreciate you bringing this up because you actually just kind of created an epiphany in me. And I'm glad because we were just talking about the frontier. Mm-hmm. And we need a frontier if we're going to have wasabi, a group feeling, a new renaissance. Like we need a frontier. And what you're talking about is essentially the new frontier is decentralization. The internet, like Bitcoin, everyone's moving out of cities because you don't need to be there anymore. And the best thinking and writers and people are just probably just living in a hut in the mountains somewhere because you can be connected to the whole world. just like we are right now. And this whole conversation, even when Ari was speaking, I was thinking like, whoa, we're actually participating in the new frontier right now. And it's the cultural decentralized frontier. I've been kind of like circling this idea for a long time. Is we think of like the age of exploration, Christopher Columbus, Magellan sailing around the world, and it was like basically a renaissance, an enlightenment happening in Europe because all of this new information and space and ideas and resources were pouring into Europe, and there was this feeling of expansion, this feeling of hope for the future, and it created it created a certain type of individual, maybe a higher type of individual, and a higher type of culture briefly. And that was like the age of expansion and exploration. And the Renaissance was very similar. Ancient Greece was very similar in these times of rapid expansion into frontiers. And that new frontier, I really think, would be decentralized communities because on that frontier, like you have this ability to master like new spaces in the sense of your own community could practice any cultural or political philosophy you wanted. You could learn how to master your own production of goods and resources together. Like there's massive amounts of adversity and space to master in a decentralized community. Even the technology, the databases, like how do we connect to one another and build these things? There's like massive problems to be solved in this space. So I think this next frontier, like for a long time, there was the industrial frontier. It was the space frontier before that, like the age of exploration, then the industrial, and now it's like the digital. And I really do think the frontier that we could find solace and community in is how do we build a cultural frontier? Anyways, I kind of had that epiphany when you were talking. So thank you for letting me share.
Right. Yeah, I mean, could be. Well,
also, I can't see any of you guys, so just start talking.
Okay. The only thing I fear though, right? And why? So like when I say like we can move away from the city centers, I don't think that I think the cities do serve a function. Industrialization serves a function, right? I think there are, and you see this in a lot of like, Nietzschean philosophy. This idea of, we talk about the higher type, right? Like not everyone wants to go move into the woods or into Montana and live
Yeah.
a life more in accordance with nature. And that's a good thing, I think, because ultimately, right, you still need a sort of people representing the larger labor class because we do need industrialization. We do need cities because without it, we're going to be overtaken by a country like China. So like I think that certain people will benefit from this decentralization, but I don't think that it can be all of society. I think we'll always need a base of people that are still, because like everyone serves a role, everyone serves a function in a hierarchy,
Yeah.
and we do need cities, we do need industrialization,
Totally.
we need to maintain, for example, a strong standing army in which we can impose our will if we need to defend what we have. So I think like it's a balance, right? We can't completely not all of us can just go into the woods, but I think there's certain people that it will benefit society, and you can have this sort of, I think, synchronization and this sort of balance of the sort of like intellectual, close to nature individuals with warrior mindset, but then you also still have that labor class which is in the cities and which is contributing, and everyone serves a function, right? If everyone left the cities,
Totally.
society, we would be overtaken by another country. So it's just important to recognize we
Yeah.
still do need
That is
strong
important.
power. Yeah.
And also, when I speak of decentralization, though, I just know like only if the few are actually going to go. Like most people are just going to. So I don't really care what society does at this point. I'm done. I'm over trying to fix society. People are going to do what they do, and like keep doing and believing and talking about the things they do. I don't care. I care about you guys and people like you guys who are like breaking out of the mainstream and wanting to create something awesome. And I think that we need to turn our gaze collectively, like in this type of community, towards people like that and just be like, yo, let the world do what it's going to do. But we need to create our own solution to our own collective problems here and now. And you also have a interesting way of talking about those topics. I'm curious to hear Ariel's response to that and your thoughts.
Yeah, I was going to speak into what you were just sharing there at the end of not worrying too much of what society is doing at large, and it brings up one of my favorite ideas, which is the switching of focus from problems to possibilities. And so what
Mm,
happens is that when our society in a lot of ways, and we as well, and it's something that we have to navigate, is we hyper fixate on problems. But what happens is that problems continuously keep coming up.
mm,
Solving the problems doesn't revolutionize anything. It just brings things back to how they were before the problem came into play. Whereas
totally.
the shift to possibilities is a conversation about not what's wrong, it's what can we do if we were to come together and use everyone's gifts in the best way possible to create a future that is decided in conversation between
Mm,
us. And I
absolutely.
feel like that shift is what's starting to happen through what you were saying with these decentralized platforms, because it's no longer determined by proximity. You no longer
Yeah.
have to navigate those local spaces in a way. And you can start tapping into these communities that exist online to create those kinds
Yeah.
of developing your own awareness and the creation of these kinds of possibilities and ideas.
Yeah.
And I feel like what will come from that, the natural response is through us gathering in this way, we will naturally show up in our local communities that will infuse these values and these ideas that will influence the proximity of those around us, creating a ripple effect.
Mm,
So I feel like it's like we're able to tap into an elixir, a
yeah.
fountain that isn't available locally, but then by tapping into it in the decentralized form, we can then distribute it locally.
Totally. I would agree and disagree in the sense of I disagree that I don't think even change can happen at the local level. I think when I speak of decentralization, I'm like, let's meet our tribe online through communities and then figure out how to create our own local tribe. And I think that's the key is like we have this opportunity to move, to go find, like to go where it's happening and actually like create something new. And I think the main trap, so many great thinkers and leaders are looking and thinking about how do I change even my local community? What's the problem with all of society? I'm like, political philosophy and these community ideals and these virtues, like they literally, when you try to extrapolate it, it doesn't work. Democracy doesn't work on a great level. Neither does aristocracy. Nothing really works when it gets too big. And it's like, how about we just bring our ideas to literally like a breakaway social decentralized systems. And I think there's opportunity to do this. I think there's massive opportunity to do this if we could get funding, resources, and figure out how to serve value to the world. We have this opportunity to have breakaway decentralized communities where we get to implement on what we believe, and that's like the true possibility. I think is even bigger than influencing a local community. Like I live in Boulder and like I have no hope of influencing the majority of the people here. Like the real hope I have is finding the heroes and the leaders in this area and bringing them together and like, hey, let's like create a new vision of what we could do together. And I think that's the idea of intentional communities, but there's a lot of faults and problems with intentional communities. I'm sure Ari is learning as he's getting involved in one. But that was kind of my thought there.
I think that's such a
So
good point. Yeah.
one thing I will say, right? Because here's the thing. Ultimately, we have to recognize, well, how do we have the ability to make these communities? And we do because ultimately our freedom is dependent upon the power of the collective group that we are a part of, which currently is the United States, right? And so I think within the framework of assuming the United States maintains its sovereignty, maintains independence from a world, and assuming that the government uh, uh, maintains the freedoms of individuals within the country, sure, we can have these communities. But the issue I have with saying is, with you saying like we have to basically step away from the community or step away from society as in general is like ultimately our
Mm.
freedom to be able to do something like go to Montana comes from the power of our collective group, which is the state. And my issue is if we aren't somehow contributing to a like I'm not even saying like support the United States as it is right now, but I am saying we need a collective group that is powerful enough to maintain its independence from other collective groups. And right now, our freedom is more or less dependent upon the power of the country that we live in. So if we just completely separate ourselves from society and don't contribute to it directly, or we're not in charge of it, then who's to say the United States maybe, God forbid, loses a war to China? And I don't think it'll ever get to the point where the U.S. is going to, for example, be invaded or whatever. That's not
Yeah.
what I'm saying. But if the United States isn't the most powerful country in the world, now other nations can do more to exert their influence and their will upon our country. Let's say the government gets to a certain point where they feel that they can infringe upon the individual liberties of people within the country, then we lose all our freedom, because our freedom is a privilege. Like, freedom is not a right in this day and age. Freedom is a privilege of, we live in this collective group that ensures our privilege in writing and the Constitution. But who's to say those things are going to be a constant in the next 100 years? And
Totally.
let's say they're right. Let's say they aren't a constant. How are we going to maintain our freedom? And that's why I think we can't completely step away, because we need to be in charge of the power to be able to ensure our own independence and our own
Yeah.
ability to do what we want to do.
Bro, you bring up a great point. Fabulous point. And it's also the argument for warriors in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we are dependent on we need a strong collective in order to maintain the freedom to have independent breakaway societies within it. So yeah, I'm glad you balanced the conversation with that perspective. Absolutely.
I love that.
And all we got to do is, hey, here's the thing. Once we have the Montana state, all we got to do is get enough people involved, get some training, get some people together, and then boom, we have our own state. No,
I
I'm just
mean,
kidding.
that's the Machiavellian ideal in a sense, is like how, like, the state is dependent on its military force. Like, without it, you
Yeah.
aren't independent and you're not free. Like, if you can't
Right.
defend yourself and provide for yourself, you're not free. You're dependent on something else. And so, like, a breakaway civilization could start reliant on the U.S. government, maybe create some kind of, within the U.S. government, like in Montana. But at some point, you need to create your own sovereignty, and that comes through your own food source and your own protection. And that's
like
just
a militia or something.
That's just the reality of Earth, which is like a lot of like people maybe in a more like spiritual or maybe more left community like don't want to acknowledge is like people will try to take what you have,
right,
if you don't have the power to defend it, and you will never be free unless you're willing to die for your freedom. In a sense, this is what every single revolution and nation is founded upon, is a whole bunch of warriors willing to die for their freedom. It's a very interesting idea that we're kind of shielded from, because we haven't had a huge war since like World War II.
Right. And even with World War II, like, it wasn't our cities getting bombed, right? So like US, whenever we fight a war, our civilians never suffer directly because of it. Whereas in Europe, people's whole cities were being blown up by bombs or whatever, or the Middle East. So we don't have that same connection, right? And it's interesting what you said, and I think something really important when you talk about, I think, we're kind of shielded from this reality. And here's something to think about. There have been times when a conventionally weaker force has triumphed, and they've always triumphed because they were willing to die for their freedom. So you take any like sort of counterinsurgency effort that we failed in, whether it's Vietnam or Afghanistan, whatever. The reason that we lost is because, these people were brave enough and willing enough to fight and die for their sovereignty, right? Whether you agree with them or not, in the case of Vietnam or Afghanistan, obviously, it's a little bit of a gray area. However, the fact that, Afghanistan was invaded by the Soviets and the United States, the two strongest powers of the 20th century, and fought both of them off eventually, it's because they were willing to die rather than be conquered. So the spirit, what I'm getting at is, the spirit is also important, the spirit of the people. It's like, how much are you willing to defend your freedoms, right? And there's this great quote, again, this is sort of paraphrase from Nietzsche in Bronze Age Mindset. He talks about like noble peoples will either, triumph or die free. And Nietzsche talks about this as well. Like the noble peoples die free. It's like you're unwilling to live a life of servitude. And ultimately, conquest is to conquer a people. It's not to kill people. So if you're not willing to be conquered, it's a good chance the conqueror eventually will give up because they want to win the people. And if they can't win the people, then they'll never win the war. So that's, the spirit is important, right? And that's something
Yeah.
that you can take hope from, you know?
Yeah. I really appreciate that perspective. Ari, what do you think about that?
That idea that you just shared about the die free or triumph, I feel that's such a powerful line. That definitely pulled on some strings for me. It hit a point, because I feel like that's what I'm tapping into now, is that discovery in that process of what it is I'm willing to die for, and what it is that I'm willing to sacrifice everything for in the pursuit of that triumph. And this is what I feel like a lot of our challenge is now. And one of the things I've been diving into is a little bit deeper understanding of religious communities, because religious communities have been so successful in the revolutions that they have led. And the reason is that within that religious community, they were all on the same page regarding a higher power. They all believed in the same God, whatever God it was, whatever religious denomination they come from. And so when they would move as one. They would be moving as one unit. So they were able to create a lot of political change within their local community, because there'd be thousands upon thousands of them rallying together to create these changes within their local communities. And so this process, I feel like what the stage that we're in now is first the recognition of our individual beliefs. And now it's in the process of discussing and sharing what our beliefs are, making them crash into each other. And like what I was saying earlier about iron sharpening iron, is that process of understanding what are the true first principles, the universal beliefs that apply to us all, that we can use as a guiding light as we move into our future. Because in my own personal life, in a very local way, I've been recognizing that my choices have become so much easier when I rely on what my priorities are. And so it's just like, for a small example, like one of my main priorities this year has been my finances. I was like, I really want to get my finances under control.
Yeah.
And so it was like, this opportunity came up. I was like, oh, like, what do I do? Like, what's the best choice to make? And I was like, rather than trying to think about the choice, let me fall back on what my priorities are and what my values are. And it was like, when I did it, I was like, oh, the choice is really easy. This is the choice. And so I feel like we're in this process of discussing what those guiding principles are in a lot of ways.
Ari, you're the man. I really love that you brought this back to religion, because this is actually I booknote this in my head to bring it back to that, but you did it. So thank you for bringing that up, because you're talking about, I was deep in the spiritual world for a long time, spiritual community, spiritual knowledge, all of that. And one of the things I've realized on the other side of that is spirituality is essentially religion without structure, without law. And because of that, anything goes. And because anything goes, spiritual people will never have a strong sense of community or camaraderie in the deepest level, because they're lacking like structure and unification. They all talk about unity, but they're actually just chaos. It's not unity, it's chaos. And it's a really interesting problem to solve, is like church people have a structure and a law to follow in terms of like how they pray and how they commune. And it takes discipline, and there's virtue in it. And there's virtue in how they connect with each other. And church for almost all of time has been this way of like creating a beautiful sense of community that's in reverence and connection to one another, and reverence and connection with God. And I think when spirituality rules, it's individualism. When religion rules, it's much more, there's much more sense of community. And I think this is the interesting thing about post-modernity, is like there's been this, let's remove all sense of objective right and wrong. Let's remove all sense of, even like gender. Let's remove all gender roles. Let's remove all sense of religion. You can believe whatever you want. And this is cool because it breaks down dogma. So dogma has been removed. But now without dogma there, it's like time for like new prophets, in a sense, to bring a new sense of religion and culture. because we don't have that anymore in the melting pot. And I think this is part of the frontier is like, okay, we have this huge spiritual, communal, religious frontier that is wide open now. It's wide open. All the walls have been melted down. What do we want to build there? And we got to build this together. And this is a huge part of like the brotherhood group is creating a masculine orientation towards spirituality, because spirituality is often really feminized. So it's just like you bring up a really interesting point is how do you create more stake in the community? How do you create more citizen and participation? How do you create group feeling? It's rooted in religion as well. We need frontier and we need religion together. And I think those two aspects, if we look at the founding of like Hindu civilization, Greek civilization, actually every single civilization ever had a unified religion and had a unified frontier. Without those two things, you don't have anything. And I think back to like the Lion King. It's like everywhere the light touches, this is your kingdom. And a king knows his boundaries and he knows his God. So it's like without those two things, there is no kingdom. So it's just a really interesting idea.
I got to go back to the Lion King at the end, so remind me if I forget. But really quick, because you're talking about religion, I sort of have what I think is a potential answer, right? And you say like, how do you get people to do, the right thing, or like the thing that's going to lead to the most success, or for yourself or for your community? Like you need organization, and I think you do need organization, but you don't want too much organization. Like we talked about, like dogma being broken down is not a bad thing inherently. It's the loss of the principles which come from the dogma which are a bad thing. Totally. And I think one perfect example of a balance of individualism but also hierarchy is if you look at like the sort of the Hellenistic religions practiced by the Greeks and the Romans. And the reason I bring that up is because of the individualism that was present in their society, and the way it differs from like what you described with spirituality in today's world is that there was individualism in the Greeks, but it was a privilege to be an individual. Like it was a heroic privilege where you didn't like being an individual wasn't just something you were born with. You had to earn the right to express yourself as a beautiful being, as this sort of tragic hero who goes into Troy and dies but is remembered for thousands of years, right, like Achilles. But it comes from a hierarchy that isn't enforced on a micro scale level, but is enforced relatively through it's enforced through incentivization it's incentivized, basically. That's how it's enforced. It's like, and it's incentivized through the hierarchy of their afterlife. Their afterlife is better if you are a hero. Heroes go to Elysium. If you go to Elysium 3 times, you go to the Isles of the Blessed. The people that they venerate in their legends are heroes. And so this isn't a micro scale micromanagement of people in the religion. It's telling them, if you do this, you will be rewarded. And it's not just saying, it's not like talking about sins or virtues or whatever. It's very broad, but it's also specific enough that we say, okay, for the Greek to be a hero, to be great, to express yourself beautifully, that is what brings you a reward. So it doesn't say exactly how you have to do it, but then, you end up with Greek heroes, you end up with great generals, great conquerors, but also philosophers, artists, and scientists. So I think that's an example of a religion that sort of, balances out individualism, but also cohesion and hierarchy.
I mean, you're hitting the nail on the head of asking the question that Nietzsche asked is, what do we put at the center of civilization? Because whatever cultural icon humanity holds up, whether it's Jesus or it's Ares, right? Like the rest of the civilization is going to come to reflect it. So a religion essentially is determining what icons, what god or pantheon of gods you put at the center, because everyone else is going to come to reflect whatever they venerate. So whatever we venerate, we become akin to. And the ancient Greeks, every single night going to bed, as a kid, your mom would be telling you stories of the Iliad, of heroes of Troy. That was your Bible. So of course they grew up to be heroes because that was their cultural icon. So that's like the question of religion is, what is the cultural icon that we can all buy in on? What's the pantheon that we can all buy in on?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So I'll chime in here just a little bit, just to kind of what comes up for me, and this is something that I've been doing for personal reasons and just a deep curiosity and exploration, is I've been reading the Bible over the last
Mm,
couple of months, and what's come up for me is that whether you believe in Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior doesn't really matter if you just look at the book, and if you see who he is as a man, to not have him as a role model, I feel like it's such a loss because
totally.
he has such a deep embodiment of what it means to show up in every context, in every capacity. I'm just like
Mm,
blown away by the stories, whether they're fiction or not. I feel it doesn't matter, in the same way that you were describing with the Iliad and those stories of the heroes. It's just like, it doesn't matter as long it's more about the feeling and the impact that it has and how you show up in your day-to-day life. That's what counts, because this
mm,
is the reality that we live in, this present moment, and this is
yeah.
what we make our choices from. So anything that we can leverage to make better choices, let's do that.
Mm. It's kind of like maybe the second coming of Christ is this the cultural icon that does create the new renaissance and the frontier.
Yeah.
So maybe that was true. You know, I like that. Mr. Warrior Philosopher, you got anything else before we wrap up this call?
No, I mean, like what kind of like what Ariel mentioned, like um, you mentioned, you just said the second, what if the second coming exists? And something I've always thought about the Bible, right? And kind of not taking things too literally, right?
Mm,
Because there, if you read, if even through my reading of, or through the parts of the Bible I have read, of course, I'm not going to agree with everything, even the messages from it necessarily, and everything. But there's so many good messages within them that we should absolutely incorporate in our lives. And one of the interesting things, and one of my little theories, like the one you just had, is some people read the Bible as once Christ comes for the second time, that's when all the souls will actually go to heaven. And right now, nobody's in heaven or hell. And the way I see that is essentially singularity. Because once we reach singularity, every piece of energy that is ever moving throughout all of existence, it still exists.
mm,
Energy is never completely expended. The same way all the atoms in our bodies have existed, for eternity or whatever. Or you know, so like, who's to say that once we reach singularity, all the souls that have ever existed are going to be access to some sort of collective consciousness, right? So like, I think about those things too. Like, how do you interpret these stories?
mm.
And look into Maimonides. He's excellent in terms of his how he reads the Bible. He's a 13th century Jewish philosopher. So that's what
Oh,
I would
interesting.
close with. Yeah, look him up. He has an excellent view of how you should interpret the Bible. So yeah,
Cool.
that's what I'll close with.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for joining, Mr. Warrior Philosopher. And Ari, do you have any final thoughts to wrap up with?
I would like to say that I'm excited. I'm excited for the Wisdom Warrior community. I'm excited for more opportunities like this. I'm excited for other men to join us in these conversations, whether they're happening live on Zoom, whether they're happening over text on the school platform, and down the road in person, whether it's at retreats or just gatherings. I'm
Yep.
pumped, man. I'm very fired up. And this conversation, I feel, captures the essence of what it is that we're working towards, and I want to continue to fuel that fire with the two
Mm,
of you and anyone who's listening and anyone who tunes in after this. Let's get it.
Let's
absolutely.
go.
Ari, you're the
Oh yeah.
man. Thank you. Thank you so much for recapping all that. And he's right. Like the school community is this place where we get to have these discussions, maybe even host calls that we can just all have together that maybe aren't live like this. Um, and even to post content. And I want leaders to rise up in there and lead stuff like this. I don't want to be the only one. I think there's a massive opportunity. And also, like Ari said, he leads retreats. I'm starting retreats. I think the opportunity for gatherings and having these conversations is amazing. And it's so funny that I had no idea, not much of a plan coming in here, but of course we talk about empire building, community building, frontiers, and how war creates virtue. And I think this is the most interesting topic on planet Earth to me is how do we create community on a frontier again? And I think I'm going to rename the Philosopher's Symposium to Empire Builders because that's what we're really
Hell
trying to
yeah.
do here. You
Hey,
know,
it's the way of the sword.
it's the way of the sword.
I love
It's
that.
also the way of the community, and like how, and we have this opportunity to learn from the past, but actually create a new paradigm in how
Yeah.
we relate to one another and how we build a thriving, flourishing sense of camaraderie and wasabia and mission towards something. So I think this is a beautiful first step. And thank you so much, both of you guys, for your perspectives. Like I can't do this alone, and it's so beautiful to have two guys who are diverse in thought like you guys, and also know who you are and can bring that. So thanks for doing that. I can't wait to have more conversations with you guys and other people in the community. So thanks for being here. And yeah, you can find Ari in the school community. He has all of his links and stuff on his bio. Same with the Warrior Philosopher. The Warrior Philosopher also has a YouTube channel, so you can check him out there. Thanks for tuning in to Wisdom Warriors, and I'll see you guys later, as long as I can unfreeze my computer screen.
It's
So,
never gonna end.
Thanks
I don't think it's gonna ever end, so I'm gonna have to force quit everything because I literally haven't been able to look at my screen for like an hour.
That's amazing.
Cool. Well, thanks for tuning in, guys. I'll talk to you later. I'm gonna shut her down.
Nice to meet you, Ari.
Yeah, man, such a pleasure. Definitely leaving with some stuff to digest and process. So looking forward to our next conversation, guys. Ciao for now.
Absolutely.
Looking forward to it as well.
Ciao.
All right, y'all have a
Peace.
good one. Bye.
All right. How do I end this?